Hello everyone, my name is Alexis Smith and I'm an undergraduate student here at the University of Central Arkansas. Today I will be presenting on Gatekeepers of Second Language Knowledge on Teacher Cognition, Teaching Methodology, and Accent Acquisition, which is the title of my undergraduate thesis, which I'm completing in partial fulfillment of the requirements to graduate from the Shedler Honors College. And my mentor is Dr. Lynn Burley and my second reader is Dr. Suzanne Johnston. To get started today, I would like to tell you a little bit about the background of this project and what really got me interested in pronunciation teaching and second language accent acquisition. When I was 12 years old, I decided on a whim one day that I wanted to learn Swedish. And so I got started with worksheets that was September of 2012. And for Christmas, I got Rosetta Stone and I started using that for the next 4 years. But when I was 16 years old, I met an international student from Sweden and she agreed to be my tutor. And so I worked with her for the next 2 years before I came here to UCA. And not only was I able to improve in the areas of language learning that you normally think of, like vocabulary or syntax, but my pronunciation also greatly improved with her help. And I believe this is because she actually would have me practice and tell me like the manner and place of articulation of certain sounds in Swedish that are not the same as they are in English. And I remember she would also tell me that she would even phone home to her dad in Sweden to tell her how good my accent was. And so I studied Swedish for 6 years primarily. When I was 14 years old, I started studying Latin as well as part of my requirements for high school. And I noticed right away that there is not this focus on pronunciation like I was getting in Swedish. And then when I came here to UCA, I studied German for a year and French for a year and a half. And for both of those, for German, there was focus on pronunciation, specifically segmental features or individual sounds within the German phonology that aren't the same in English. Another way to put that is that German has certain sounds that English doesn't, and so we would focus and practice making like those sounds. But I didn't notice the same experience in the French classes I took. And I noticed too that it took me a lot longer to really get some of the sounds down in French, a lot longer than what I was used to working in classrooms or with a tutor where pronunciation was something that was taught explicitly. And so thinking about my own experience of learning a second language, it got me wondering what is like the best way to teach pronunciation. And in doing a little bit more research about this, I found that that explicitly teaching specifically the suprasegmental features of a second language, or things like intonation, pitch, rhythm, those things actually had the most impact on helping L2 learners or second language learners gain better accents in their second language, in their L2. And so my initial question was, if there's this method out there that is like teaching the suprasegmental features of languages explicitly, then why wasn't this more widely used? And also, why was pronunciation such a neglected area within L2 teaching? So those were my initial questions. And so from there, I really started to ask myself, like, well, why do pronunciation and accent really matter? Like, what's their effect on communication? And I came across a quote by Anne Lazarton in a chapter she wrote for one of the textbooks I had to read for a class of mine. And she said, speaking is the most fundamental skill in second language learning. And when I read that, it really hit home to me that that's true, not only in second language learning or L2 learning, but also in first language or L1 learning. Because way before we learn how to read or write, we're speaking and we're listening. And pronunciation and accent both have a huge impact on not only how we are perceived by others and understood by others, but how well we can understand others. And so that is without an understandable or comprehensible or intelligible pronunciation or accent, communication breakdowns can occur. And actually, there are several examples I would like to share of just how big of an impact pronunciation and accent can have on communication itself. One is taken from Janet Goodwin in a chapter she wrote for that same textbook of mine that Anne Lazarton wrote a chapter for, and she gave the example of a graduate student that was studying here in the United States from China. And the student talked about how she struggled with communicating with others, mainly because they would always ask her, "Oh, can you please repeat that?" And it really led to her feeling judged and isolated, and sometimes she said even embarrassed. And another example is from a personal communication that I had with an English as a second language teacher, and she said that that there was once a student who had really great control over their grammatical structures. And so nothing was wrong with their language grammatically, but their speech was so heavily accented that communication breakdowns still occurred. And so these are the reasons why pronunciation and accent matters, because they can not only lead to breakdowns in communication, but they can also lead to L2 learners or second language learners feeling isolated or judged or even embarrassed, like in the example from Goodwin. Now, after finding out and researching more into why pronunciation and accent matter, the next question would be, if we want to get people to the point where they have a comprehensible and intelligible accent, where they don't experience breakdowns in communication, where they don't experience that isolation and those feelings of being judged, how is the best that we can do this? And researching more into this, I did find that there's an overwhelming positive response to explicitly teaching the suprasegmental features of people's L2 or second language or their target language. And so after finding this out, I began to ask myself, why was this method not more widely used? Because originally it originated in the Netherlands, and so my question was, why wasn't this more widely used outside of the Netherlands? And so to answer that question, I had to first find out what the approaches were throughout time, and also what the current notions and underlying assumptions were about pronunciation teaching nowadays, or in our own time. And so what I found was that in the beginning, with the grammar translation method, pronunciation was never discussed at all, simply because for the grammar translation method, this really emphasized learning a language not to communicate with others, but rather to be able to read texts written in that language, or to be able to translate from that language into English, French, Spanish, or into your L1. And so this method was mainly used to study dead languages such as Latin, and they also used to study things like ancient Greek and biblical Hebrew, languages that aren't used primarily for communication nowadays. But this, however, changed in the 1890s with the advent of the direct and reform methods, which did emphasize pronunciation teaching, and which in fact even said that pronunciation was best taught explicitly. And so this method was used until around the 1960s. The audiolingual method did come in around World War II. However, in 1960, or in the 1960s, this is when everything changed with the advent of the cognitive approach. And this approach not only revolutionized the field of linguistics itself, but also language teaching, applied linguistics. and it sadly de-emphasized pronunciation in favor of grammar and vocabulary. And so the cognitive approach was really the method to use until the 1980s, when we saw the advent of the communicative approach. And so while this approach, it does not de-emphasize the teaching of pronunciation necessarily. However, there's not been an agreed upon method for teaching pronunciation, and this has been found to be the most difficult aspect, I guess you could say, with the communicative approach in regard to pronunciation, and why we still don't see the emphasis on it as we did during the direct and reform methods. And so, yes, the communicative approach does not have any one method or way to teach pronunciation. And so nowadays, or currently, what the primary method is correcting pronunciation errors and accent difficulties as they occur. So as L2 teachers notice their students making mistakes, they correct them then, but they don't do anything to prevent these mistakes from happening, or from explicitly teaching their students pronunciation. And so after finding out a bit more, researching more into the history of language teaching and just how the role of pronunciation has changed throughout all the different methods that have come and gone, I began to look into current notions or assumptions underlying pronunciation teaching, and I found several key factors. One was the research gap, and this was discovered in a study by Wahid and Sulan in 2013, and they found that where theory is, application doesn't necessarily use it. And that is to say that what researchers were discovering, teachers were not necessarily implementing in the classroom, because they found that this gap existed where teachers do not trust researchers, because they feel that they've been in the classroom, they know what works, and so it's very difficult in order to bring new research into at least K through 12 classrooms. Another factor that I found underlying notions of pronunciation teaching nowadays is that a native-like accent is not the goal of most language programs. And this could be said to be due to the critical period hypothesis, which posits that you only have really until puberty to learn a language and learn it to a native-like degree. But it's also because, another reason for this is because there really isn't enough time. Language learning takes many, many hours, and this translates into years. And so due to the fact that most colleges are only 4 years, there really isn't a way for students to gain a native-like accent in that short amount of time. And then another factor that I found was that in a study done in 2020 by Nguyen and Newton, they found that for L2 teachers, pronunciation was not considered to be valuable. They also found that there was a lack of time to teach pronunciation and also a lack of materials to teach it. And this, in fact, the lack of materials also was related to another factor, and that is that there was a lack of training in L2 teachers in phonetics, phonology, and or pronunciation methodology. That is, they didn't feel comfortable teaching pronunciation because they had never been trained in the modules of language like phonology that you need to know in order to teach it. And then finally, another factor that I found was that of teacher cognition, which according to Baker, in her study in 2014, she found to be the mental constructions or the beliefs, assumptions, and attitudes that teachers hold about different ideas in the world, but that then they bring into the classroom. I developed the hypothesis that teacher cognition would probably be the key factor in determining L2 teachers' attitudes towards pronunciation, but also that their educational background would probably have the biggest influence on their teacher cognition. That is, what courses they themselves took, what methods they were trained in, and what values they were taught about the different modules of the language. And so from this, I developed the following hypotheses. The first was that the primary source of L2 or second language teachers' beliefs, perceptions, and attitudes, or their teacher cognition, comes from their educational background. I hypothesized that if the participants received training in phonetics, phonology, or pronunciation methodology, then they would deem pronunciation as important, that they would teach it within the classroom, and that they would have heard and or used the method of explicitly teaching the suprasegmental features of their students' target language. However, I also hypothesized that if participants received no training in phonetics, phonology, and or pronunciation methodology, then they would deem pronunciation as less important, that they would not teach it within the classroom, and that they also would not have heard of and or used the method of explicitly teaching the suprasegmental features of their students' target language. I also hypothesized that if the participants received training in a method that predates the cognitive approach and the communicative approach, then they would be more likely to teach pronunciation within their classroom. However, if they were taught or trained in a method that includes or succeeds the cognitive or communicative approach, then they would be less likely to teach pronunciation within their classroom. And from these hypotheses, I decided to conduct interviews. And so I had a total of 4 participants. All were L2 instructors who taught at the college level. The interviews themselves were IRB approved. They were conducted either in person or over Zoom. They elicited qualitative data. And for the interviews, I used a guide of 18 questions. However, participants only had to answer 16 because depending on how they answered the 15th, they would either answer just the 16th, 17th, or 18th. And finally, because the interviews elicited qualitative data, I used a form of thematic analysis by Richard E. Boyatzis from his 1998 book. I use this method to transform the data from qualitative data into quantitative data. The results then from this were that 3 of the 4 participants, or 74%, were trained in phonetics, phonology, and or pronunciation methodology, either while earning their degrees or at, in the case of one participant, they received training in phonology through a summer institute that was accredited, and that was specifically for teaching English as a second language. 3 out of 4 participants, or 75%, deemed pronunciation as important. And what's significant about this is that the same 3 who had received training in phonetics, phonology, and or pronunciation methodology, they were the same ones who deemed pronunciation as important, whereas the one participant who did not receive training in these areas deemed it as less important. However, despite this, 100%, or 4 out of 4 of the participants taught pronunciation within the classroom. One participant received training in a method that predates the cognitive and communicative approaches. They received training in the audiolingual method. And then 3 of the 4 participants received training in a method that includes or succeeds the cognitive or communicative approach. And it's also significant that these 3 participants, the one who received training in the audiolingual approach also received training in the communicative approach. And then for the one participant who didn't receive training in phonetics, phonology, and also who did not deem pronunciation as, or who deemed it as less important, they did not receive training in any of these methods. And so yes, those were the results of my study. And overall, what this tells us is that only one of my hypotheses was supported, and that is that training in phonetics, phonology, and or pronunciation methodology does seem to have an effect on whether or not they deem pronunciation as important. However, my other hypotheses, such as that this would predict them being more likely to teach pronunciation within the classroom, was not supported. It also was not supported that the particular method that or approach that they were trained in would deem whether or not they taught pronunciation within the classroom. And I find these things very interesting, specifically in the case of the participant who deemed it as less important and yet still taught it within their classroom. Through all of this, it would seem that educational background on teacher cognition is significant. Yes, and we see this through the 4 participants having training, teaching in their classroom, as well as deeming it important. Whereas for one who did not receive training, deemed it as less important, though they still taught it within their classroom. And also during the interviews, some additional information that I acquired was that even though all of the participants had differed somewhat in their views of pronunciations or their reasoning for why they taught it within their classroom, all of the participants had the same view of the overall goal they had for the accent acquisition of their students. And that is to help their students be comprehensible. And what is most fascinating about this to me is that not only do L2 teachers see a subtle yet striking difference between pronunciation and accent, but even more so than this, they're teaching pronunciation not so that their students become native-like or perfect or have like a perfect pronunciation, but because they want them to be comprehensible. That is, they understand that if they don't teach pronunciation, if the students don't learn correct pronunciation, then communication errors can occur. And so I thought that was very fascinating. And also another significance of the findings is that the approach or method that the participants were trained in does not necessarily, or so the data here suggests, determine what they teach within their classrooms. And I also found that to be really, really fascinating, considering that methods such as the direct and reform methods emphasize the teaching of pronunciation, whereas methods like the the cognitive method did not emphasize that. And so the final part of this presentation would be the limitations and further lines of inquiry. And certainly by far the biggest limitation would have to be the sample size. I would love to be able to do this study again and have more participants, or if it's done elsewhere, definitely more participants are needed in order to see if these trends hold up. And also, further lines of inquiry would be looking at the race, ethnicity, and country of origin of L2 teachers, as not all countries have the same exact perceptions of second language learning and teaching, in language ideologies even. And also another line of inquiry that was actually brought up by one of the participants, insofar that they mentioned that their language was, even though it wasn't English, it was one that was related to English. And this got me thinking that perhaps language relatedness could have something to do with the relevance of the method of explicitly teaching the supersegmental features of L2 teachers' target, or students' target language, precisely because for some related languages, they might have the exact same supersegmental features, or very similar ones. And so in regard to L1 transfer, or into when you're acquiring a second language, I believe that further studies need to be done in order to see if language relatedness has an impact on whether or not we should use this method. And so with that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. And I appreciate your time and your attention, and thank you.